I think most of you already know which is my favourite classic. G'day to all you lovely people and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to give you a list of my top 15 favourite classics. And I use the term a little loosely. I think some people may not consider all of these books classics, though I do. As far as I'm concerned, if it has stood the test of time, then I consider it to be a classic. And this list is in no particular order, except for the last 3 or 4. They're my all-time favourites. And the first is this. And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. As far as I'm concerned, she was the best murder mystery writer that I have ever read. That doesn't mean she may be yours, but she is definitely mine. There is no one, I think, who matches her for plotting. Her plots are always so difficult to predict and surprising. And it's incredible how she is able to give you the clues throughout the book so that when you reach the end you think, how did I not see that? It's a story about 10 people who are lured to an island which is only accessible by boat and are left there when the boatman returns to the mainland. And then people start dying. And what is so good about this is not just the plot itself, which is superb, it's also the character study. We don't spend a lot of time with them, but we understand all of them. We understand their motivations, their history, what kind of people they are. I did not guess the ending of this. I remember reading it when I was a teenager, and I was just blown away, and I reread it a couple of years ago and I still love this book. It is definitely one of my favourite classics, in the murder mystery genre anyway. Next is this, These Old Shades by Georgette Heyer. Heyer wrote, I think, in the 20s, and she wrote 2 types of books. There were murder mysteries, which I have not read, and historical romances, quite a few of them. In fact, it was a result of Georgette Heyer's books that the phrase Regency romance was coined, because most of her books are set in that period, in the late 1700s or 1800s. And Heyer had thousands of documents and books relating to that period. So each of her books feels very authentic because of the detail that she has included. Very similar in style to Jane Austen, but I find these much, much funnier. And this was the first one I read, so I think it might be a favourite because I have nostalgic attachment to it. It is about a duke who rescues a young boy and realizes that there might be a way that he could utilize this boy to exact revenge on another noble who has slighted him. But it is the characters who are so memorable and lovable. Even the Duke, who is difficult to like in the beginning, does develop throughout this book. I absolutely love one of the main characters, and I love the adventures that occur to the characters in this book. It is definitely one of my favourites of Georgette Heyer's, and I had a lot of difficulty choosing one, and I do consider this a classic. Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. This was, I think, written in the early 1800s, and it is the story about a young student who commits a crime and his questioning of what is a crime. Is it a crime when it breaks the laws only, or is it a crime against morality? Is there morality? I believe the book was written in reaction to certain philosophies that were taking hold of Russia at the time, such as nihilism and utilitarianism. It's not one of the easiest books I've read, but I think I would enjoy it even more on a reread because I would be able to pick up things I might have missed the first time. But I couldn't stop reading it. I had to know how it was going to end, and whilst I was slightly dissatisfied with the ending, on the other hand, I think I understood what the author was aiming for, which might be presumptuous on my part, but I felt that the punishment aspect wasn't necessarily about the sanction of a court, but rather what effect committing a crime has on our own consciences, on the student's conscience, and how that can be even more effective than, say, a prison sentence. There's a lot to this story that I think would benefit anyone who has a good grasp of philosophy, which I don't, but even so, I just really love this glimpse in life in Russia during the 1800s and the effect of some of these philosophies on the populace at the time. Not the easiest book to read, but definitely well worth it. Animal Farm by George Orwell. I only recently read this and I just loved it. This book, I think, was written by Orwell in reaction to communism, particularly in Soviet Union. And the way he portrayed communism in this book is by utilizing farm animals to represent different types of people. I thought it was brilliant. It's very, very short, but it is just brilliant, so clever. The use of these animals to represent, say, greed, for example, corruption, sheep, who obviously represented the masses, things like that. It's just so well done. And the ending, yeah, it seemed fitting, actually. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Now, I first read this when I was a teenager. I read it many, many times. I wore out my copy because I just loved it. It was a glimpse, I guess. I'm not sure when this took place. I think it was in the 1800s, about a family of 4 daughters and a mother and father who struggled during that time. I think what I love so much about this is the relationships between all of the characters who seem very distinctive to me. I loved Jo, the second sister. I hated the youngest for most of the book, and I just loved how they all differed. None of them were the same, which is so spot on when it comes to families. This was a book that made me laugh and made me cry, and I still love it to this day. Next is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I've seen films based on this story, so I thought when I read the book recently, I knew what it would be about. But I was very pleasantly surprised. This relates to a scientist, Dr. Jekyll, who creates a formula that changes him into another person, Mr. Hyde, who has very few moral boundaries, who basically seems to be like the opposite of Dr. Jekyll. Based on the films I saw, I always thought that Dr. Jekyll had created this formula by accident, that he had no interest in allowing this amoral character, Dr. Hyde, free rein. However, that is not what the book is about. The book is about duality. the duality of our nature, how we are constrained by society to behave a certain way, which Dr. Jekyll found very confining. And his aim was to split the bad side of his nature, but to allow it free rein. So he didn't have to feel guilt about Mr. Hyde's actions. I found this absolutely fascinating. And I also found that Dr. Jekyll was not so much a character to be pitied, because Hyde was still part of him. He just didn't want to acknowledge that horrible side of him, nor did he want to practice restraint from allowing that side of him free rein. I loved how this book changed my perception of this story, and I really loved this exploration of the duality of our natures, how we are capable of both great things and terrible things. Next, Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I read this book as a child. I would have been maybe 13, 14, and it shocked me. And I reread it recently, just last year actually, and I still love it. This is a story about a group of young English boys who are stranded on a deserted island. I think they're 12 and under, and how these boys cope with no adult supervision, how they cope with surviving on this island. In my opinion, this is a real indictment on human nature, that if you strip away civilization, we are capable of such savagery, of such violence, not only against the world in general, but also against each other. It also illustrates how easy it is for strong personalities to influence others. For me, this book, just like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, illustrates that we have two sides of our nature, where we can do great things and we can do terrible things. And that left to our own devices, without structure, without rules, we can become savages or descend into savagery. Great book, which I think everyone should read. Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Again, this is one I've seen many films that are based on the book, and I didn't really want to read it because I thought I already know what this story is, but I found it utterly delightful. I absolutely loved the book. It was so cleverly written. It had a lot of strange and bizarre characters that populate this world, and I love the imagination that Carroll shows, and I also found it very funny at times. But I was completely charmed by the book, even more so than the films. The sequel I didn't like as much, but I definitely loved the first. Next, I'm going to include two. The Iliad by Homer and The Odyssey by Homer. I read these quite a few years ago now, and given that my background is Greek, it's no surprising that I love them. I've always been fascinated by Greek mythology, and especially the Iliad. It deals with the gods of the Greek pantheon. It deals with war. It deals with pride, revenge. It also shows us the warfare tactics at the time. And of course, it is populated by very well-known figures such as Helen of Troy, Paris, Achilles, Agamemnon, Ajax, Hector. It is like a rollicking adventure, but it also deals with some darker themes, such as the cost of pride, revenge. I like The Odyssey, though, even more. It is the story of Odysseus and his journey to get back home to his long-suffering, patient wife Penelope. And I just loved how imaginative it was. I also loved the character of Penelope, Odysseus' wife. She is such a faithful, loyal wife who, despite how difficult it was for her, she never wavered in her faith that her husband would come back. Macbeth by William Shakespeare. My favourite play of his. I've always loved the way the characters are portrayed in that play, particularly Lady Macbeth, who is a horrible character, controlling, manipulative of her husband to do something terrible. I don't want to spoil it if people don't know this play. I read this for school at a very young age, probably 13 or 14, and then we watched a film based on the play, and it has stuck with me all these years. And I love how it portrayed greed and ambition as basically the downfall of people, of otherwise good people. But it was Lady Macbeth that always struck me so powerfully. Someone who, behind the scenes, kept trying to manipulate her husband to do what she wanted because her ambition was out of control. And yet in the end, regretted her decision. Out, damn spot, out. One of my favourite lines throughout this play. I just love this play. I think it has a lot to say about being moderate in our desires, in our ambitions, and that ambition and greed are not always things to strive for. That it can change your basic nature if you allow those things to control your life, and that you will pay a heavy price for them. And I know Shakespeare isn't for everyone, but his use of language was so beautiful, and there's always a message or a moral that he imparts, especially in his dramas, not his comedies. The last 5 are probably my favourites of all the classics I've read. And I'll start with this. Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. This is a book I only read a few years ago and I just loved it. It is about book burning. It is a dystopian world set in the future, and what blew me away when I read it was how prophetic it seemed. I believe it was written in the 50s, and yet he seemed to describe where we would be at in society today. The commentary he has regarding how society is structured is very relevant today, how individualism is not valued, that people are meant to be just like everyone else, that we're all meant to conform. And if we fail to conform, then we are ostracized or punished in some way. How we are not encouraged to think, how we are basically given all these distractions. That's what happens in this book, but it also applies today. How there are all these distractions that have been created to stop us from thinking, from questioning things. I loved this book so much that when I finished it, I couldn't believe how closely Bradbury had envisaged what our life would be like. This is a great book which I think everyone should read, and I hate to say it, but it is still quite relevant today. Yeah. Next, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This was a book that I avoided for many years because I'd seen so many films based on this story. But when I did finally read it, I wish I had read it earlier. Shelley was very young when she wrote this. I think she was 19, perhaps even younger. But her use of language is so beautiful. I absolutely love the writing. But this is also a very sad story. And it's not about the monster that Frankenstein has created, but about Frankenstein himself and the effect on him of having created this monster. Many of the films I watched spent a lot of time on the creation of the monster. In the book, I think it's a paragraph because that's not so significant. What is the effect on Frankenstein himself having let loose this monster, as he calls him, or creature, in this world. Now, initially, I felt very sorry for the monster, but as time passed, I started to feel a lot less sympathy for him. Because of his actions, he didn't seem to have any moral center, so he felt it was okay to punish the world because he was treated differently, because he was hated, because he looked different. The book has a lot to say about fitting in as well, but it also is a cautionary tale against ambition, that perhaps just because you can do something, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe Frankenstein shouldn't have tried to create a creature. I would read it again just for the writing. It's also considered one of the first, if not first, science fiction novels. Yeah, highly recommend Frankenstein. Next, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I've seen many films again based on Wells's books, but I didn't start reading him until a few years ago, and I absolutely love all of his books that I've read so far. And I think I've read around 4, and I'm going to read more. It was hard to choose which one was my favourite, but I just loved War of the Worlds. Now, Wells was writing at the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th, around there. So War of the Worlds actually takes place in London pre-aeroplanes, pre-cars, pre-many advancements in weapons that we've seen in all the films that are based on this book. And I thought, how are these people going to cope with this invasion when they don't have anything like aeroplanes or weapons that could take down these creatures? It's told from the perspective of one particular character and his observations of the effect of this invasion on England at the time. And I just found it really powerful. And I just loved watching this society having to suffer through this invasion with no hope, with no chance of succeeding against these superior invaders. It helps put in perspective how small we are, which we never think. We always think we are the rulers of the universe. But how do we know? How do we know there aren't much more superior species out there? How would we cope? Would we be considered just insignificant to them? Well, that's the sort of questions that I always think about when I read science fiction in particular. But Wells has become one of my favourite writers, and I am just loving exploring his books. But War of the Worlds is definitely my favourite of his, so far anyway. 1984 by George Orwell. I read this when I was younger, when I was in my 20s, and I remember just being blown away by it. And I reread it a few years ago, and I think I appreciated it even more now because I've experienced more of life. I've seen more of life. And this is a very bleak book in many ways. Again, individualism is not only discouraged, but actually quashed. Everyone is supposed to conform. Conformity is what's required in the world that Orwell created. This is also a dystopian book where a totalitarian government sets the rules, which are so narrow and confining that it allows no room for any dissent whatsoever. A lot of catchphrases have come out of this book, such as Big Brother, watching over you, the thought police, and in a way it's quite horrifying to think maybe we could get to this point at some stage in the future. I really hope we don't, but the characters are not allowed to have any individual or independent thought. They must follow the policy of this government, and if they fail to, then they will be, I don't recall what the word is, but I think they will be cleansed or reprogrammed. Definitely not a world I want to live in. Definitely not an easy book to read. It can be very depressing at times, but I think it is an extremely important book that everyone should read. And whilst I never really loved my time reading this book, I will read it again because I love it so much for all it has to say about conformity in particular and the discouragement of any individuality in people. Sometimes I do feel that that is the society we live in today. We are not encouraged to be different. We are encouraged to be like everyone else. And heaven help you if you are different. I love this book. It is, I'd say, my second favourite classic. Yeah, I'm sure many of you people won't be surprised at this, but perhaps some will. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I have a lovely Eastern Press leather-bound edition because this is my all-time favourite book. I read this when I was young again. I was, 13, 14. I'd read everything in the house. So I started rating my brother's school books, and this was one of his. I didn't study this in high school. So I picked it up and read it and loved it from the first page. And I read it many, many times. It is about a lawyer in, I think, the Deep South who represents a black man against an accusation of rape, and the effect on both himself and his children of the racism, the anger of the townspeople. One of theirs, Atticus Finch, the lawyer, is representing a black man. We view most of the book through the eyes of his two children, Scout and Jem, and they are just utterly delightful children, and their observations of racism in particular and how it doesn't make sense to them just really resonated with me. And also Atticus's courage in standing up against the town because he believed it was important that this black man be defended. This is a book that made me laugh many times, but also makes me cry. And this is also the book that inspired me in my own life and my own choices in life. For someone like me who's always had a very strong sense of justice, of fair play, this book spoke to me on so many levels. And it had a profound effect on not just my view of the world and how unfair it could be, but that one person standing up could make a difference. If you have not read To Kill a Mockingbird, I highly recommend it. This is a book that I will just reread over and over again for the rest of my life because it is my absolute favourite classic. And I think it goes even beyond that. It's one of my favourite books, full stop. Well, that is my top 15 favourite classics. Now, of course, I want to hear what you think of my list. Do you disagree with some of them? Do you agree with me? And I also would love to hear what your favourite classics are. Well, thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And if you like this video, then you know what to do, right? I don't need to tell you. I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support me in that way. I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.